Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a fascinating connection today. That between Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, and the ancient and honorable fraternity of Freemasonry.
It's a huge part of his story. We've got a great source here, William Harvey's 1921 book, Robert Burns as a Freemason, guiding us.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most important bits, the key insights.
And some surprising facts, too, to bring this really significant aspect of Burns' world to life.
Yeah, it's about understanding not just that he was a Mason, which most people know,
Sure.
but what did that actually mean for him? You know, the people he met, the roles he played.
How it all wove into his life and his work.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut, really, to seeing the craft through Burns' eyes. It's filled with wonderfully specific details from the time.
So where should we start? Right at the beginning of his Masonic journey.
Let's do that.
And it's quite the journey.
Yeah.
Robert Burns is, arguably the most distinguished name on the entire roll of Scottish Freemasonry.
That's a big claim, but probably true.
It is. And his involvement wasn't fleeting. It spanned 15 years, right from his initiation in 1781, right up until he died in 1796.
And the source makes it clear he was genuinely invested, right?
Yeah.
Keenly interested, I think was the phrase.
Definitely. He wasn't just a name on the books.
Nope.
And this all kicks off in Tarbolton, Ayrshire.
Small town beginnings.
That's where the story starts. Now, the Masonic scene in Tarbolton back then was, well, a little complicated.
How so?
The local lodges, they traced their lineage back to Mother Kilwinning, which is, one of Scotland's oldest lodges.
Okay.
Initially, there was just one Tarbolton lodge, chartered in 1771, but things didn't stay simple for long.
Bit of drama.
You could say that. In 1773, about 20 members split off. They formed a new lodge called St. David's.
Right.
Then, just a year later, the members who were left in the original lodge, they kind of reestablished themselves, but under a new name, St. James's.
So suddenly you've got two lodges in this little village.
Exactly. Probably, as this source suggests, a bit of local jealousy or rivalry fueling it.
Okay, two lodges. Did they manage to coexist?
Not for long, really. It seems they realized Tarbolton wasn't quite big enough for the both of them, so they decided to unite.
Makes sense.
This union happened on June 25th, 1781, and they decided to operate under the name St. David's, arguing it held the oldest charter.
And this is the moment Burns steps onto the Masonic stage.
Precisely. Just 9 days after this union, on July 4th, 1781, a date with other significance, Robert Burns was initiated into this newly merged St. David's Lodge.
Do we know any details about that, like the cost or who did it?
We do. His entrance fee was 12 shillings and sixpence. And the man who initiated him was a local tailor, a brother named Alexander Wood.
A tailor. That's such a grounded detail. You can almost picture the scene.
It really helps, doesn't it? It grounds it in the reality of these local community lodges. And the minute entry from that night is fascinatingly brief.
What does it say?
Just Robert Burns in Lockley was entered an apprentice. That's it. The source points out it's almost as if his initiation was the only thing that mattered that evening. Nothing else recorded.
But there's some debate about where this actually happened, a tavern or somewhere else.
Yes, that's right. Tradition often points to Manson's Tavern. But the source mentions another view, backed by some research, suggesting the lodge actually met in the Bachelor's Club Hall in Tarbolton.
Okay.
So that might be the more likely spot where Burns took his first Masonic steps.
And he didn't stay and entered apprentice for very long?
No, he moved up pretty quickly. On October 1st, 1781, so just a few months later, he was passed to the degree of Fellowcraft and then raised to Master Mason.
All on the same night.
Seems so. And again, according to the lodge minutes, he was the only business conducted that evening.
Really?
The entry just says, Robert Burns in Lockley was passed and raised. We even know the officers present Henry Cowan as master, James Humphrey and Alex Smith as wardens, Robert Woodrow as secretary, James Manson the treasurer.
So by late 1781, he's a full master mason. He's back living at Lockley Farm near Tarbolton. But that lodge union, it didn't last, did it?
No, it fell apart fairly quickly.
Oh.
The source says the United St. David's Lodge was not happy. It seems some members, particularly those from the original St. James's, felt their identity had been lost in the merger. So less than a year after uniting,
They split again.
they did. A group, interestingly, including the secretary of the short-lived United Lodge, withdrew and reestablished St. James's Lodge on June 17th, 1782.
And Burns, he had to choose a side, essentially.
He did. And he went with the seceders, From that point forward, he was firmly associated with St. James's Lodge.
Even though this reestablished lodge was facing problems.
Big problems. The source describes it being in a wretched situation financially. Members weren't paying their dues.
Oh, dear.
And there was even uncertainty about their official standing with the Grand Lodge due to some dispute. The source says, how decided, or if decided at all, we know not.
But Burns didn't just drift away. He got involved.
Quite the opposite. The source says there are indications he was not in any sense inactive. And this is where we see his skills being put to use for the lodge.
The letter, right, to the master.
Exactly. A really key piece of evidence is this letter written to their formal master, Sir John Whiteford, basically pleading for help.
And it's in Burns's handwriting.
Yes. The source confirms it's in his hand and suggests he probably had the chief share in actually composing it. It really lays out their problems.
What sort of things did they say? What was this wretched situation?
Well, the letter mentions considerable sums in bills which lie by unpaid debts, essentially.
Right.
It complains that many of our members never mind their yearly dues. And maybe most worryingly, it says, since the separation, we're not sure even of our existence as a legitimate lodge.
Wow, that's serious.
It really was. It was a very humble appeal, asking Sir John to call a meeting so they could figure out some means to retrieve our wretched affairs.
So Burns stepping up like this, using his writing skills, it showed his commitment.
Absolutely. His role in drafting that appeal, combined with his obvious interest, clearly raised his profile within the struggling lodge.
And led to him taking on a leadership role.
It paved the way. The lodge moved its meeting place. They seemed to move around a bit this time to the Cross Keys Public House. And it was there, on July 27, 1784, that the brethren chose Robert Burns as their depute master.
Depute master, what exactly did that mean in practice? Was it different from the master?
Yeah, it was a common setup back then. Often, a lodge would have a prominent local gentleman, maybe a laird or someone like Sir John Whiteford, as the nominal master. He might not attend very often.
Ah, like an honorary position almost.
Sort of. The depute master was the brother who did the actual work, presiding over meetings, initiating new members, running the lodge day to day.
So Burns became the real engine of the lodge.
Pretty much. He was the virtual master of St. James for 4 years. He even refers to it in his famous farewell poem, where he says he was oft honored with supreme command.
And by all accounts, he didn't just hold the title, he really threw himself into it.
He absolutely did. The source quotes Robert Chambers, an early biographer, saying, Burns was so keen a Mason that he would hold lodges for the admission of new members in his own house.
Holding lodge meetings at his own house? That's dedication.
Isn't it? And apparently his own brother, Gilbert Burns, was admitted into Masonry at one of these very meetings held at Robert's home.
Incredible. What about the official lodge meetings? How often did he make it to those?
Well, during his 4 years as depute master, St. James's Lodge met 70 times.
Okay.
Burns was present at 33 of those, which is pretty good going, especially when you consider his absences were mainly during 1787 and 1788.
When his life completely changed.
Exactly. Those momentous years when his fame exploded and he was traveling in Edinburgh.
It sounds like his time in Tarbolton, especially as depute master, wasn't just about formal lodge business. He was surrounded by these characters, lodge brothers, who then turn up in his poems.
This is where it gets really fascinating, seeing that direct link between his Masonic life and his creative work. The source really emphasizes how many people Burns wrote about were his brethren in St. James's.
Like who? Give us an example.
Okay, well, the very first person Burns initiated as depute master was a man named Matthew Hall. He was a local Ayrshire fiddler.
The fiddle.
Yeah, and Burns later immortalized him in the poem The Briggs of Ayr as the Therm-inspiring sage. The Therm meaning catgut strings.
Ah.
And apparently Hall treasured that memory, being initiated by Burns for the rest of his life.
That's lovely. What about the famous Dr. Hornbook? Was he a Mason too?
Indeed he was. John Wilson. He was actually the lodge secretary while Burns was depute master, and he was a local schoolmaster.
So Dr. Hornbook was the lodge secretary.
That's him. He's best known by that satirical nickname Burns gave him. Wilson, besides teaching, ran a little grocery shop, and trying to branch out, he started selling some medical preparations based on a popular health manual of the day, Buchan's Domestic Medicine.
Right, offering medical advice alongside groceries.
Pretty much. Offering free advice, selling these remedies. And the incident that sparked the poem happened at a lodge meeting in spring 1785.
What happened?
Apparently, Wilson made a rather pompous parade, as the source puts it, of his medical knowledge and his cures.
No.
This hugely amused Burns, who knew perfectly well Wilson had no real medical training or capacity, as he saw it.
So Burns called him out.
Well, tradition says they got into quite a heated argument to loggerheads, is the old phrase used, both during the meeting and afterwards. They supposedly parted ways angrily at Tarbolton Mill on the walk home.
And that sparked the poem Death and Dr. Hornbook.
That's the story. The poem imagines Death complaining that Hornbook is putting him out of business with his quack remedies.
Now, the common belief, often repeated, is that this poem absolutely ruined John Wilson's life and reputation.
Yes, that story got around thanks largely to early biographers like Lockhart. But
it's not quite true.
The source highlights later research showing it's probably an exaggeration. Wilson actually stayed on as lodge secretary for another 2 years after the poem was published.
Really?
And he remained the session clerk for the local church until 1793. So he wasn't exactly driven out of town in disgrace.
What did Wilson himself think of the poem?
Apparently, he later told Gilbert Burns that while it was pretty severe, he actually thought it was rather a compliment. He preferred being satirized to being ignored altogether.
That's a brilliant attitude. It really shows the dynamics within that small lodge community, doesn't it? Even biting satire could be taken in stride, almost.
It seems so. And Wilson wasn't the only lodge character Burns poked fun at in verse. You mentioned James Humphrey earlier.
Yes, the senior warden at Burns' initiation.
That's him. The source paints a vivid picture. A critic of sermons, a long-tongued disputant, a noisy polemic who loved a good argument.
Sounds like fun at parties.
Apparently, he used to debate theology, specifically the New Light versus Auld Light controversy, with Baines during the harmony sessions after lodge meetings. Added a bit of spice of excitement, the source says.
And Burns wrote something for him, too. An epitaph.
He did. A rather cheeky epitaph that gave Humphrey, like Wilson, a kind of inglorious immortality.
And was Humphrey offended?
Not a bit of it. Like Wilson, he seems to have been rather pleased by the attention. He lived a long life, until 1844, and apparently took great pride in pointing himself out as the blethering bitch, the chattering fool that Burns mentioned in the epitaph.
Amazing. So these lodge gatherings, they weren't just social drinking sessions, were they? There were real debates, theological arguments.
That definitely comes through. The lodge was a space where these kinds of discussions happened, mixing the social, the intellectual, and sometimes the controversial aspects of life in 18th century Scotland.
There's a really curious little story about the lodge trying to find a permanent home involving a steeple.
Oh yes, that's a strange one. From March 1786, the lodge was looking for a proper meeting place. At the same time, the local landowners, the heritors, were planning to build a new steeple for the church.
Okay.
So the lodge came up with this proposition. They'd contribute £15, quite a sum, then plus whatever else they could raise from friends, towards the steeple fund.
In return for what? In
return for the base of the steeple being built as a dedicated lodge room.
So, a Masonic lodge inside the church steeple.
That seems to have been the plan. A committee was formed, including Burns, to look into it. But the source just says, rather anticlimactically, what became of the proposal does not appear. Lost to history, I suppose.
Shame. They did have public events, though, like processions. That seems more straightforward.
Oh, yes. The big annual meeting was June 24th, St. John the Baptist's Day. And it was often marked by a public procession through the town.
Right.
And Burns, as the Depute Master, was clearly very keen to make sure they had a good turnout for these public appearances. We actually have a rhyming invitation he sent out.
A poem as an RSVP?
Pretty much. He sent one to a Dr. Mackenzie for the June 1786 meeting, urging him to come.
What does that invitation tell us about the mix of solemnity and fun?
It captures it perfectly. He urges Mackenzie to join the grand procession planned for Friday 1st. That's the formal duty.
Okay.
But then he adds they'll also get a blind of Johnny's morals, a taste of St. John's principles, and they'll taste a swatch of Manson's barrels.
Manson's barrels. That's the tavern keeper again.
Exactly. James Manson, who ran the Cross Keys where they were meeting. So it's explicitly promising both Masonic instruction and good drinks. Duty and pleasure, side by side.
That really sums it up. How was Burns actually perceived when he was in the master's chair leading these meetings?
He seems to have been very impressive. Professor Dugald Stewart, the famous philosopher who knew Burns, saw him preside once.
What did he think?
Stewart remarked on Burns' ability to deliver compliments to visitors or new members that were happily conceived and forcibly, as well as fluently expressed. He had real presence.
There's another story about that, isn't there? Someone not recognizing him.
Yes, involving Dr. Mackenzie again. A friend of Mackenzie's had met Burns earlier in the day, just informally. Later, he saw Burns presiding over the lodge under new circumstances, in the master's chair, looking authoritative. The friend apparently didn't even recognize him at first. It shows how different Burns could appear when taking on that formal role.
Right, let's fast forward a bit to 1786. This is a absolutely massive year for Burns.
Pivotal. Huge changes. The Kilmarnock volume of his poems is published.
Which brings him his first real taste of fame, locally at least. The source notes copies are now worth considerably more than its weight in gold.
Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
But alongside that success, he's facing serious personal problems. The difficult situation with Jean Armour.
His relationship troubles.
Yes. And it's during this time he seriously contemplates leaving Scotland altogether. He's making plans to go to Jamaica.
To work on a plantation, right.
Yeah.
As an overseer or slave driver, as the source puts it bluntly.
That was the plan. A stark contrast to the poet we know.
And it's often thought that his famous poem, Farewell to the Brethren of St. James's Lodge, was written right at this low point, just before he expected to leave forever.
That's the traditional view, yeah. Biographers like Robert Chambers believed it was composed then, as he was packing his bags for Jamaica, essentially.
But there's a bit of a wrinkle in the timeline.
There is. He seems to have settled on the Jamaica plan around June 12, 1786. But then, just 4 days later, on June 16th, he was re-elected as Depute Master of St. James's.
That doesn't quite fit with him saying a final farewell, does it?
Not really. So some researchers, like Henley and Henderson mentioned in the source, suggest a slightly different timing. They think the verses were more likely recited at the lodge meeting held on June 23rd.
Ah, the meeting he invited Dr. Mackenzie to with the promise of Manson's barrels.
Exactly. That timing makes more sense. He's still in his role, even if departure is looming. It's a farewell, but perhaps not quite the final act it's sometimes portrayed as.
Okay, that context is important. It's such a well-known Masonic poem. Maybe you could recite a bit of it?
Sure. It's considered one of his most felicitous Masonic verses. It starts, Adieu, a heart-warm fond adieu, dear brothers of the mystic tie. Ye favored, ye enlightened few, companions of my social joy, though I to foreign lands must hie, pursuing fortune's sliddery ball, with melting heart and brimful eye, I'll mind you still, though far away.
Mystic tie, that really captures the bond.
It does, and he goes on. Oft if I met your social band, and spent the cheerful festive night, oft, honored with supreme command, presided o'er the sons of light, and by that hieroglyphic bright, presided o'er the sons of light, which none but craftsmen ever saw, presided o'er the sons of light, strong memory on my heart shall write, presided o'er the sons of light, those happy scenes when far away.
Sons of light, hieroglyphic bright, it's packed with Masonic language.
Absolutely. He invokes the core symbols and ideals, freedom, harmony, and love, the grand design, the omniscient eye above, the glorious architect divine, keeping the unerring line rising by the plummet's law. It's a summary of Masonic principles woven into his farewell.
And then there's that really poignant request at the end.
Yes. A last request permit me here. When yearly ye assemble one round, I ask you with a tear, to him, the bard that's far away.
Asking them to remember him with a toast each year? Powerful stuff.
It really is. And just before that, there's a stanza praising someone specific. And you farewell, whose merits claim justly that highest badge to wear.
The highest badge. That must mean the master of the lodge.
That's the logical assumption. At St. James's, the nominal master at the time was Captain James Montgomery.
So he's praising Montgomery.
Almost certainly. Although the source mentions one scholar suggested it might have been William Wallace, who was the master of the other Tarbolton Lodge, St. David's, because Wallace was prominent, and de Scotia Deer.
But hang on, why would Burns, in a poem saying farewell specifically to the Brethren of St. James's Lodge, single out the master of their rival lodge for praise? That seems unlikely.
That's precisely the argument the source makes. It concludes it's far more reasonable to assume he was complimenting his own lodge's master, Captain Montgomery. Praising a rival just wouldn't make sense in that context.
Right. And does St. James's Lodge still honor that request? To remember him yearly?
Yes. The source confirms they faithfully observe that tradition, remembering the bard that's far away at their annual gatherings, a direct legacy of that poem.
So thankfully for Scottish literature, the Jamaica plans fall through.
Yes. The success of the Kilmarnock edition grows, leading to the decision to go to Edinburgh instead, to publish a new edition.
And his Masonic connections seem to smooth the path for him there, too, or at least provide immediate entry into certain circles.
They absolutely do. Even before he gets to Edinburgh, he receives recognition. Lodge St. John Kilwinning in Kilmarnock made him an honorary member in October 1786.
That's interesting. The minutes record him as Robert Burns, poet from Moshline, a member of St. James's Tarbolton.
It's significant, according to the source. Not only his first recorded honorary membership, but apparently the first time a lodge minute explicitly describes him as a poet.
Acknowledging his new public identity. And he wrote a song for them in return.
He did. Ye Sons of Old Killie, a classic Burns Masonic song. It includes lines reinforcing Masonic values like, may secrecy round be the mystical bound, and brotherly love be the center.
Did he visit other local lodges around Ayrshire before heading to the capital?
It seems likely. Records show him being admitted as a member of Loudon Kilwinning and Newmilns in March 1786. And there are strong traditions, though maybe less documented, of him visiting lodges in Sorn and St. Andrew's Lodge in Irvine.
Irvine. Well, wasn't there a story about a particular verse being added to one of his songs there?
Yes, there's speculation that a very famous stanza, often added to tavern songs, might have originated around the time of a visit to Irvine.
Which one is that?
The one celebrating the big-bellied bottle. It goes, then fill up a bumper and make it o'erflow. And honors Masonic, prepare for to throw. May every true brother of the compass and square have a big-bellied bottle when harassed with care.
Okay, that definitely reinforces the convivial side of the craft we were talking about.
It certainly does. So fast forward to November 1786. He's finally off to Edinburgh, and there's this great anecdote about his farewell from St. James back in Tarbolton.
The late night.
The very late night. Based on the reminiscences of the lodge's old Tyler, John Lees, he remembered Burns' farewell meeting on November 10th as an awful night, meaning awe-inspiring or full-on. Probably they didn't break up until 5 o'clock in the morning.
Wow, quite the send-off. He arrives in Edinburgh on November 28th.
And he finds Freemasonry is a very visible part of the city's elite social life. Just 2 days after arriving, November 30th, is St. Andrew's Day.
The Grand Lodge Festival.
Exactly, a major public event. Elections held in St. Giles Cathedral, then a grand procession through the streets to St. Andrew's Church for a Masonic service.
Did Burns take part?
The source suggests it's possible he did, perhaps even in full Masonic regalia, joining the procession just days after arriving. It would have been quite an entrance.
And he started making important connections almost immediately through Masonic circles.
Yes, very quickly. He attended a meeting of the prestigious lodge Canongate Kilwinning on December 7th, 1786.
And who did he meet there?
Some very influential figures. James Cunningham, the Earl of Glencairn, and the Honorable Henry Erskine, who was Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, a top legal position. He was introduced by another brother, James Dalrymple of Orangefield.
And Burns was clearly bowled over by these connections.
You can see it in a letter he wrote that same evening back to his friend Gavin Hamilton in Ayrshire. He's bussin'.
What did he say?
He talks about Glencairn and Erskine having taken me under their wing, and jokes he expects soon to be ranked as the 10th worthy and the 8th wise man of the world. High praise.
And he mentions Dalrymple, too.
Yes, using that powerful quote from Proverbs, "A friend that sticketh closer than a brother," shows the immediate impact these Masonic introductions had.
Lord Glencairn seems to have been particularly crucial for Burns' success in Edinburgh.
Hugely important. The source really details Glencairn's vital support. He introduced Burns to William Creech, who became his Edinburgh publisher.
Right.
Glencairn secured the patronage of the Caledonian Hunt, a group of wealthy, influential noblemen for the Edinburgh edition, which was a massive boost. He helped find subscribers, and later even used his influence to help Burns get his post in the excise service.
Burns clearly never forgot that patronage.
Never. He was devastated by Glencairn's early death. He wrote a very moving letter expressing his sorrow at not being able to attend the funeral, wishing he could pay a tear at the interment. And his lament for James, Earl of Glencairn, is one of his most heartfelt poems of gratitude.
That concluding stanza is so powerful.
It really is. The mother may forget the child that smiles so sweetly on her knee, but I'll remember thee, Glencairn, and that thou hast done for me. Just pure heartfelt gratitude.
And then, just a month or so later, January 1787, comes that incredibly famous incident at another lodge meeting.
Yes, the toast. This happened at St. Andrew's Lodge on January 12, 1787. Grand Lodge was visiting, including the Grand Master, Francis Charteris, Burns of
When a Grand Master proposed a toast?
He did. To Caledonia and Caledonia's bard, Brother Burns.
Imagine hearing that. How did Burns describe the reaction?
He wrote about it later. He said the toast rung through the whole assembly with multiplied honors and repeated acclamations. The place erupted.
And how did he feel?
Completely overwhelmed. By his own account, he was thunderstruck. He was trembling as he stood up to reply.
Did he manage to say anything?
He did manage a reply, though he felt it was inadequate. But apparently some of the grand officers standing near him murmured, "Very well indeed," which Burns said, "Set me something to rights again."
What a moment. It shows both the immense public recognition and maybe the supportive aspect of the lodge environment helping him through it.
Exactly. A blend of public triumph and fraternal encouragement.
And after this, he formally affiliated with Lodge Canongate Kilwinning, the one where he met Glen Cairn.
Yes, he did. On February 1st, 1787, the lodge minutes record his presence as a great poetic writer. That description again. And note it was unanimously agreed to assume him a member of the lodge.
Okay, so he's now officially a member of this prestigious Edinburgh Lodge. Which brings us neatly to one of the most enduring traditions and maybe the biggest controversy surrounding Burns and Freemasonry.
Ah, yes. The Poet Laureate story.
The idea that Lodge Canongate Kilwinning formally installed him as their Poet Laureate.
It's a tradition the lodge itself holds very dear. The story goes that at a meeting after his affiliation, perhaps early March 1787, there was a ceremony where Burns was given this title.
And there's that famous painting depicting it.
That's right. The big painting by Brother Stuart Watson titled The Inauguration of Burns as Poet Laureate of Lodge Canongate Kilwinning. It's quite a scene.
Describe it. It shows Burns dramatically ascending some steps towards the master's chair. The master is placing a laurel wreath on his head, and they're surrounded by about 60 figures, supposedly all the illustrious brethren present that night. There was even a book published by a brother James Marshall detailing the event and listing the attendees. The lodge, as the source says, clings fondly to this tradition.
Okay, so what's the actual evidence cited for this inauguration ceremony having taken place?
Well, proponents point to a few things. Firstly, later lodge records. When Canongate Kilwinning subscribed to the fund for Burns Mausoleum in Dumfries in 1815, their minutes refer to him as our late poet laureate, Robert Burns.
Okay, that's later, but it's something.
Right. Then, even later in 1835, the lodge elected James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd, as Burns' successor. Hogg himself acknowledged this succession, and the minutes record the brethren drinking a toast to the memory of Burns as the last poet laureate of the lodge.
Interesting. Were people who might have been there in 1787 still around in 1815 or 1835?
It's possible. The argument is that these assertions were made relatively soon after this supposed event, potentially in the presence of members who would have known if it were untrue. There's also testimony from one brother, William Petrie, much later in 1845, who claimed he was actually present at the inauguration.
He claimed he was there.
Yes, but the source is quite cautious about this testimony, noting it's viewed with suspicion. It might be a confused memory, or perhaps similar to the exaggerated reminiscences of John Lee's about the farewell party.
Okay, so that's the case for the tradition. What are the arguments against it actually happening, especially the grand ceremony?
The arguments against are pretty strong, actually. The biggest one is the complete lack of any contemporary record in the lodge's own minutes from 1787.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. The minutes for early March 1787, when the ceremony supposedly occurred, are silent on the matter. If such a major event happened, honoring Scotland's most famous poet, you'd expect some mention.
That is strange. What else?
Then there's Burns himself, his own absolute and unimaginable silence on the subject.
He never mentioned it.
Not once. In all his letters, his journals, anywhere. You'd think being made poet laureate of a prestigious Edinburgh lodge would have given him very great satisfaction, as the source puts it, and that he'd have told his friends about it. But nothing.
That's a powerful point. What about the painting?
The painting, while iconic, has historical inaccuracies. It includes figures who weren't actually Masons, or who weren't in Edinburgh at the time, or who simply didn't know Burns yet in early 1787.
So it's more of a symbolic representation than a factual snapshot.
Exactly. It's a tribute, gathering together people associated with Burns in the lodge, rather than a documentary record of a specific event on a specific night.
So even the experts, Masonic historians, are divided on this.
Completely. The source highlights the fascinating case of the Grand Secretary of Scotland at the time, David Murray Lyon, a top Masonic historian.
What did he say?
Well, confusingly, in a letter to Lodge Canongate Kilwinning, he seemed to support the idea, saying there was evidence for it, even if the painting wasn't accurate in detail. But in his own definitive history of Scottish Freemasonry, Lyon stated flatly that the election and inauguration never took place and dismissed the whole thing as a myth.
Wow, so he said different things in different contexts.
Apparently so, which just shows how contested this tradition is.
So the final verdict is?
The source basically concludes it's a historical puzzle that will likely never be lifted out of the region of dispute. It leaves it as a nut for literary and Masonic antiquaries to crack.
A historical mystery.
But the source quickly adds, whether or not he got that specific lodge title doesn't really matter in the grand scheme. By this point, Burns was undeniably surely winning his way to the position of Poet Laureate of the Scottish people.
That's the title that really counts, isn't it? So after his triumphant time in Edinburgh, where contemporaries noted the excessive attention paid him, but also his good sense and not getting too carried away, he hits the road again.
Yes, more travels. Accounts from people like Dugald Stewart confirm he handled the fame well. In May 1787, he sets off on his border tour.
And he had a Masonic companion for this trip.
He did. A young lawyer named Robert Ainslie, who was a member of St. Luke's Lodge in Edinburgh. They traveled together.
And it was during this tour that Burns received a higher Masonic degree.
That's right. When they reached the town of Eyemouth on May 19th, 1787, Burns visited the local lodge, St. Abbs.
And
There, he was exalted into the Royal Arch degree of Masonry. This is a separate order, building on the first 3 craft degrees.
is there a record of this?
Yes, the local Royal Arch Minute Book records his admission. Interestingly, they admitted him free of charge on account of R. Burns' remarkable poetical genius, and the minute notes the chapter felt honored by his presence. He apparently spent a very enjoyable day with the joyous, warm-hearted companions there.
His documented connection with the Royal Arch seems quite brief, though.
It does. That Eyemouth record is the main piece of evidence. The only other clear link is a metaphor he used much later, in a 1793 letter defending his loyalty to the crown.
What did he say?
He referred to the monarch as the sacred keystone of our Royal Arch Constitution, using that specific Masonic imagery.
Ah, interesting. He also picked up the freedom of the burgh in Dumfries around this time during his travels.
Yes, another honor bestowed on him. He then returned to Ayrshire in June 1787, and technically, St. James's Lodge re-elected him as Depute Master again, although the source notes the relevant minute is unsigned, oddly.
So even with all the Edinburgh fame and travel, he was still nominally in charge back in Tarbolton.
For a short while longer, it seems. Even as he was making plans for his next big move to the farm at Ellisland near Dumfries, St. James's Lodge actually held a couple of meetings by deputation in Mauchline, which was closer for him.
And Burns presided over those.
Yes, he chaired meetings in Mauchline in July and November 1788. The July meeting is quite notable.
Why?
Because several prominent local figures were admitted as honorary members that day. Many of them already connected to Burns outside of Masonry.
Like Professor Dugald Stewart, who we mentioned saw him preside?
Yes, Stewart was made an honorary member then, as was Claude Alexander, a relative of the bonny lass of Balkmyle Burns wrote about, and John Farquhar Gray, the Justice of the Peace, who had been involved in formalizing Burns's irregular marriage to Jean Armour.
So the lodge continued to be a central point for his social and professional network in Ayrshire.
Absolutely. And he still showed concern for the lodge's affairs, even when he was away. There's a letter he wrote from Edinburgh back to St. James's in August 1787.
What was that about?
He was apologizing for missing a quarterly meeting that was supposed to discuss how to recover unpaid dues from members.
Ah, the ongoing financial woes.
Exactly. But Burns, in his letter, actually advocates for leniency. He urges the lodge leadership to delay prosecuting defaulters and to spare them if they confess their difficulties and ask for more time.
Shows a compassionate side to his leadership.
It does. He also undertook a long northern tour of Scotland later that summer.
With Willie Nicol, his rather difficult friend.
That's the one. August and September 1787. A huge trip, 600 miles. But interestingly, unlike the border tour with Ainslie, there's no record of him receiving any particular lodge hospitality or visiting lodges on this northern journey.
Although there's a tradition in Stirling.
Yes, Stirling Ancient Lodge No. 30 has a strong tradition that Burns attended one of their meetings and signed their visitor's book or register. But frustratingly, that book later disappeared.
So no proof.
No documentary proof. But the source notes that testimony supporting the tradition still existed among older Masons in 1921, another one of those persistent, unprovable stories.
He spent a second winter in Edinburgh, 1787-88, still mixing in Masonic circles.
Yes, his connections remained important. For instance, Patrick Millar of Dulswin, the man from whom he eventually leased Ellen's farm, was a fellow member of Canongate Kilwinning Lodge.
Right.
As was Alexander Woodlang Sandy Wood, the surgeon who was instrumental in helping Burns secure his excise commission, his day job.
So key life events still facilitated through these connections. Did he attend many meetings that winter?
It said he attended many meetings, but again, the actual documentary evidence is surprisingly thin for that period. Just one lodge minute mentioning his presence and one letter.
The letter about going to the theater.
That's it. He wrote to his friend Archibald Lowry, saying he was going to the theater that night, specifically because the Grand Master and the Brethren of Grand Lodge were attending in formal Masonic attire.
Shows the public face of Masonry, then.
And its patronage of the arts, like drama.
He finally leaves Edinburgh for good and returns to Ayrshire in March 1788.
Yes, this time to get practical instruction in his new job as a gauger, an excise officer.
Yeah.
And who teaches him the ropes, another Mason,
Of course.
Brother James Finley, who was also a member of Burns's own St. James's Lodge in Tarbolton.
It really was all interconnected. Did Burns preside over St. James's again?
One last recorded time,
Yeah.
May 23rd, 1788. After that, his instructor, James Finley, took over from him as Depute Master.
And then Burns moves to Ellisland.
By June 24th, 1788, St. John's Day again, he settled into his new farm near Dumfries.
And he clearly felt the separation from his old Tarbolton Lodge life.
Very much so. The source quotes some lines he wrote to another Ayrshire friend, Hugh Parker, where he describes Dumfries as a strange land and an uncouth clime, saying how much he missed the Masonic fellowship back in Tarbolton.
So that meeting he presided over in Mauchline in November 1788 really marks the end of his active connection with St. James's.
Yes, that seems to be the conclusion of his era there. He had been, as the source says, the life and soul of the lodge for 4 years.
Leaving an immortal memory. And the lodge still treasures the physical reminders of his time there.
Oh, absolutely. The minute book from his time is described as a sacred possession. They resisted offers to sell it over the years. It contains those 3 minutes actually written in his own hand.
Including the one about candles and paper?
Yes. Just a simple note ordering supplies, but the source suggests even there you see his literary conceit, his careful phrasing. He also signed his name in the book 29 times.
Any variations in the signature?
Yes. Sometimes just initials, sometimes the full name. There's one instance where he signed Robbed Burns and added a Masonic 9-point mark. The source speculates, based on handwriting analysis maybe, that this particular signature might have been made under unfortunate conditions, perhaps when he was unwell or troubled. Pure speculation, though.
Fascinating. What other relics do they have at St. James's?
Quite a collection. The actual chair, footstool, and mallet he used when presiding as Depute Master. The silver badge mentioned in his farewell poem, a Bible and ink bottle bought for the lodge during his term, the square and compasses from that time, that letter he wrote from Edinburgh pleading for leniency for debtors, and even, touchingly, a section of a hawthorn tree linked to the spot where he supposedly parted from Highland Mary.
Wow, tangible links back to him. So he moves south to Dumfriesshire. Does he formally join a lodge there?
He does. He affiliates with the local lodge, St. Andrew No. 179, in Dumfries Town on December 27, 1788.
And the minute recording his joining is a bit messy.
Famously so. The source describes it as riddled with inaccuracies, spelling mistakes, bad punctuation, even getting lodge names and numbers mixed up.
Why so sloppy?
Well, the meeting was just after the St. John's Day festivities. The source humorously suggests the secretary might have been suffering from a bit of post-celebration haze.
A likely story, so he joins as an affiliate.
Yes, meaning they recognized his existing Master Mason status from St. James and welcomed him into their lodge. He remained an active member of Dumfries St. Andrew until his death.
What was his life like in Dumfries generally? The farm didn't work out?
No, Ellisland proved a struggle. He described it as a fight with poverty. He gave up the farm lease in November 1791 and moved his family into Dumfries town itself, focusing on his excise job. He was promoted to a town-based role, earning about £70 a year.
Was he very active in the Dumfries Lodge? How often did he attend?
He attended fairly regularly, yes. Between December 1791 and his death in July 1796, St. Andrew's Lodge held 16 meetings. Burns was present at 11 of them.
Good attendance. Any notable Masonic figures he interacted with in Dumfries?
Yes, several. His immediate boss and friend in the excise, Alexander Finlater, was a fellow member. Finlater later strongly defended Burns against accusations of excessive drinking and neglecting his duties.
That's important context. Who else?
Another prominent member was John Syme of Rydale, a lawyer and local official, admitted in 1792. Syme was a close associate of Burns, but he's also the source of that rather harsh alleged comment about Burns being burnt to a cinder, often interpreted as a reference to his lifestyle or drinking habits.
A complex relationship, perhaps? Did Burns hold any office in the Dumfries Lodge?
He acted as a steward for the lodge briefly in February 1792. He was also elected senior warden, the second most senior office, but seems to have served only very briefly, possibly due to illness. Alexander Findlater later took on that role.
When was his very last recorded lodge meeting?
The minutes show him present on January 28, 1796. On that occasion, he recommended a new candidate, James Georgeson. And interestingly, the source notes Georgeson's entry fees were used directly to cover the lodge's expenses for the evening, for the refreshment of the Merry Masons, as the minute puts it.
Merry Masons again. And his final attendance.
His very last appearance at any Masonic gathering seems to have been on April 14, 1796. The lodge held a special meeting at the local coffeehouse. Burns attended, even though he was, by then, far gone in his last illness.
Why did he make the effort?
It's thought he specifically wanted to be there for the initiation of a Captain Adam Gordon, a final act of fraternity, perhaps. He died just 3 months later on July 21st, 1796.
And like St. James's, the Dumfries Lodge also treasures its Burns connection and relics.
Absolutely. After his death, the lodge furnishings and items associated with him gained huge interest. The source mentions that in 1879, the Grand Lodge of Scotland acquired several key relics from Dumfries St. Andrews.
What sort of things?
The minute book containing Burns' signature and the record of his affiliation, the master's mallet used during his time, and an apron used in the lodge ceremonies.
So both St. James's in Tarbolton and St. Andrew's in Dumfries are still active and hold these important relics.
Yes, they both cherish their Burns heritage. Interestingly, the original lodge where Burns was first initiated, St. David's in Tarbolton, fell on hard times later. It was struck off the Grand Lodge roll for a while in the 19th century, though was later reestablished.
And its crucial minute book, the one with his initiation record.
That book, with the record of him being entered an apprentice and later passed and raised, isn't actually held by the reestablished St. David's Lodge today. It's kept nearby as a historical exhibit in the Burns Tavern in Tarbolton.
Fascinating how these things move around. Okay, this whole deep dive through the records, the anecdotes, the timelines. It brings us back to a really fundamental question that the source grapples with. What was the main draw of Freemasonry for Robert Burns? Was it the serious stuff, the morality, the symbolism, the mystic tie? Or was it more about the social life, the good fellowship, the Merry Masons?
Ah, the perennial debate. It's complex. The source addresses the assertion made by some, particularly within the craft, that Burns somehow owed his success, his advancement in life, to Freemasonry.
What does the source say about that?
It pushes back quite strongly. It argues his literary genius stood on its own massive merit. It didn't need adventitious aid from Masonic connections to flourish. He was already becoming famous before the influential Edinburgh Masons really took notice of him.
Right.
And it questions the narrative sometimes where the Grand Lodge feasted him for an hour in Edinburgh and then just let him sink back into poverty. It wasn't quite like that.
But that said, his social and professional network was undeniably saturated with Masons. You can't ignore that.
Absolutely not. The source states it plainly. Almost all his friends in Ayrshire and at Edinburgh were members of the craft. It's quite staggering when you list them.
A huge list.
From the highest ranks, like Lord Elcho or Glencairn, down to his local pals like the argumentative James Humphrey in Tarbolton, Aiken, Hamilton, Ballantyne, Whiteford, his landlords, publishers like Creech, artists like Bucco and Naismith, his touring companion Ainsley, doctors, lawyers like Monboddo. The list goes on and on. His world was Masonic.
And what about the influence on his actual writing? Some Masons claim the spirit of Masonry shines through his best work.
Yes, that claim is made. People point to the ideals of brotherhood, equality, sympathy found in poems like Address to the Dale, where he finds pity even for Satan, or the social commentary in Man Was Made to Mourn, and of course, the ultimate anthem of equality. A man's a man for all that.
Does the source agree?
It acknowledges that the beautiful sentiments of the order likely had some influence on his thinking and writing. How could they not, given his deep involvement?
The source seems to lean more towards the social aspect being the primary driver for him.
It does present what it calls a strong presumption that Burns was attracted more by the good fellowship and social feeling than purely by the system of morality or the deeper symbolism. It argues that from his earliest days, even before becoming a Mason, festive companionship appealed to him.
He wrote about himself before he was 18, didn't he? Saying he could handle a big pub bill and wasn't afraid of a drunken squabble.
He did write something like that, suggesting that inclination towards conviviality was perhaps already there, although his brother Gilbert offered a slightly different take. Gilbert said Masonry was Robert's first introduction to the life of a boon companion, implying the lodges led him into that scene.
Ah, so Gilbert blames the Masons.
Well, maybe partly. But Gilbert immediately follows that up by insisting he personally never saw the bard intoxicated, and that Robert was not at all given to liquor.
Which sounds, well, maybe a little bit like protective brotherly spin, given everything else we know.
It does seem somewhat contradicted by other evidence, including Burns's own writings and the culture of the time. The source makes it very clear it was a hard-drinking era across all levels of society.
And Masonic lodges were definitely part of that culture.
Very much so. As the source colorfully puts it, the pint stoop and the toddy ladle were the working tools of the social side of lodge life. Meetings were frequent and often an excuse for the flowing bowl.
We saw that with George Goulson's fees and Dumfries going straight to the Merry Masons' expenses.
Exactly. And Burns's own verse about the big-bellied bottle explicitly links it to Masonic fellowship. Reputations, the source suggests, could even be measured by how much punch you could handle.
The ultimate example being the story of the bustle.
Oh, absolutely. That legendary drinking contest, held in 1789 at Friars Carse, near Ellisland, it pitted three gentlemen against each other to see who could drink the most claret without falling under the table.
And one of the contestants was a prominent Mason.
Yes. Alexander Ferguson of Craignarock, who won the contest, was none other than the Right Worshipful Master of Burns Edinburgh Lodge, Canongate Kilwinning.
The master of the lodge won a drinking contest. How much did he drink?
According to the story Burns immortalized in his poem The Whistle, Ferguson was still standing after downing over 5 bottles of claret. Burns was there as the judge and poetic chronicler, celebrating the victor.
Incredible. And there's even a fake relic connected to this story.
Yes, another example of Masonic myth-making. A rather ornate Scotch mull, or snuff box, turned up later, claimed to have been a gift from the winner, Craignarock, to Burns as thanks for writing the poem.
What's wrong with it?
It had an inscription dating the gift to October 16, 1790, but the actual drinking contest took place on October 16, 1789.
The date is wrong.
Exactly. That simple error reveals it as a fake. The source Riley calls this relic not less mythical than the inauguration, another legend built up around Burns and the craft.
So even the objects tell stories, sometimes false ones. What else did Burns himself say, linking drinking and Masons?
Well, besides the big-bellied bottle verse, there's that line in his Epistle to Davy, where he describes his life being whiles dazed with love, whiles dazed with drink, with jads or Masons, grouping Masons with other distractions or indulgences.
Right.
And remember that invitation to Dr. Mackenzie for the St. James's meeting. It explicitly promised a chance to taste a swatch of Manson's barrels. The conclusion seems pretty clear. Burns spent many a cheerful festive night, as he called it, under Masonic auspices.
And Edinburgh had its own circle of Merry Masons he associated with.
Yes, the source mentions a trio. Willie Dunbar, a lawyer, William Nicol, the schoolmaster friend he toured with, and William Cruikshank, another teacher. Burns was close to them.
And there's a poem about them.
There are some verses, probably legendary like the inauguration, describing a symposium, a drinking party featuring Burns, these three Willies, Patrick Millar, his landlord, and John Gray.
What's depicted in this mythical gathering?
It paints a picture of a lively night. Lots of fun, Masonic references thrown about, plenty of whiskey, and debates ranging from ancient history, Tyre and Hiram, to classical studies, Draco and Athens, and even contemporary politics, reform.
It captures that blend of intellectual energy and sheer conviviality that might have characterized some Masonic gatherings.
Precisely. And the source reiterates that across multiple accounts, Burns was generally agreed to be the life and soul of these kinds of social gatherings.
People joined lodges just to meet him.
One source, James Marshall, claimed some became Masons in order to meet him. And James Gray, another contemporary, said Burns frequented convivial parties from the same feelings with which he wrote poetry, a natural expression of his sociable, creative spirit.
But this relentless sociability, the drinking, it inevitably took its toll, especially later in his life.
The source is clear about that. It notes these gatherings ate up slices of his constitution. He was, it says starkly, not a Merry Mason for nothing. There was a cost.
The famous song, Willie Brewed a Peck-a-Mott, seems to capture this perfectly.
It does. The tradition behind it involves Burns, Willie Nicol, and Alan Masterton, who wrote the tune, having a legendary week of merrymaking in Dumfries. The song itself, with its defiant celebration of drinking, is described by the source as the ultimate lyrical expression of the festive aspect of what Burns called the Masonic idea.
And even that very early poem, Death in Dr. Hornbook, which satirized a fellow Mason,
Stemmed directly from a Masonic meeting and gave us that classic phrase for late-night revelry, the wee short hour ayont the twal.
And John Syme, his Dumfries friend and brother Mason, his hospitality was renowned, but maybe also part of the problem.
That's the implication. Syme, who allegedly made the burnt to a cinder comment, was known for his hospitality. Burns was a frequent visitor. The source suggests some of that burning likely happened at Syme's own dinner table. There's even a tumbler from Syme's house with an inscription warning about the danger in the cup, but admitting the bewitching nature of the man and his wine.
So relics associated with conviviality are also part of the Burns Masonic story.
Yes. Besides the tumbler, the source mentions a large marble punch bowl associated with Inverary Lodge, and even a black bottle shaped like a mason's mallet, all memorials to the importance of shared drink in the Masonic culture Burns inhabited.
Okay, so stepping back from all these fascinating, sometimes contradictory details and stories, what's the big picture takeaway from this deep dive into Burns and Freemasonry?
I think the main thing is that this wasn't just a casual affiliation for him. It was deep. He was an active leader for years. He presided over lodges, initiated members.
And he was absolutely surrounded by Masonic friends and contacts. It was his network.
Exactly. His social and professional life was incredibly intertwined with the craft.
And for you, the listener, those aha moments are maybe realizing how direct the links were.
Definitely. Discovering that specific poems, famous characters like Dr. Hornbook, came directly out of lodge incidents. Learning about the day-to-day customs, the processions, the slightly odd attempt to build a room in a steeple.
The sheer prevalence of the drinking culture back then.
Right. And seeing the historical debates play out like the poet laureate controversy shows how history isn't always neat, even for someone as famous as Burns. You get these multiple perspectives.
So what is really understanding that Freemasonry was a vital part, a backdrop, and a network for his life in 18th century Scotland?
Precisely. It provided support, inspiration, characters for his work, and the setting for many famous anecdotes. You can't really understand Burns fully without understanding this significant Masonic dimension to his life.
So this deep dive into the sources, especially Harvey's book, it really shows us that Robert Burns's connection to Freemasonry was, well, much richer and more complex than just saying he was a member of a club.
Oh, far more. It was a thread woven deeply through his life, wasn't it? Through his friendships, his troubles, even the very stories behind some of his most famous poems.
From leading lodges in Tarbolton and debating theology or lodge finances, to navigating personal crises and sharing those cheerful, festive nights with his brethren, his time as a Mason was clearly full of incredibly diverse experiences.
Definitely. And, whether he was officially installed as poet laureate in that grand ceremony in Edinburgh or not.
Which seems unlikely based on the evidence.
Right. Likely a myth. But regardless, it's absolutely clear that the craft, his fellow Masons, provided him with a community that genuinely celebrated his genius. They saw him as their bard.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, thinking about everything we've discussed. The source describes both the profound mystic tie, the symbolism, the ideals of brotherhood, and the undeniable, pervasive presence of the flowing bowl and that whole culture of the Merry Masons.
Two quite different aspects, side by side.
Exactly. So what does that blend tell us about the world Burns lived in? And maybe more compellingly, how did he, the poet, the complex individual, reconcile or draw from these seemingly contrasting facets of his Masonic experience? It really leaves you wondering about the deeper layers beneath the history we've uncovered.